Hooray, it works. So thank you very much. Delighted to be here. For those of you that don't know me or don't know much about my background, I'll kind of slowly introduce myself anyway as I go through. So I'm not in healthcare, although I'll explain my chair of Clinical Human Factors Group in a moment. That's what I do for a living. I fly planes. It's my passion. This photo's quite old. It's about 16, 17 years ago. And I like it because I have hair in that picture. So it's a very happy picture in that respect. But this is what I do, it's what I love, and it's my life. When you look at the cockpit there, it looks kind of confusing. There's lots of dials and switches and all that sort of stuff. And actually it's laid out in a very logical way, despite what it looks like. But it does remind me of a true story from Heathrow many years ago, when an American pilot committed the cardinal sin of, as he was welcoming his passengers on board with his public address, he transmitted it over the radio instead of to the passengers, so all the other aircraft on the frequency and the air traffic controllers heard it. So he gets halfway through his PA and he suddenly realises his mistake, and he stops and he pauses for a moment and he decides the best thing to do is to just own up to it. So he presses the transmit button again and says, "Gee guys, I'm sorry, there's so many switches and buttons in this cockpit." And almost straight away a British voice came back and said, "Yes, but there's only one knob." That's kind of the theme really of what I'm going to talk about, because unfortunately sometimes that knob is us. I do this for a hobby as well, a bit of aerobatic teaching. I'm the one on the left, by the way. It kind of focuses the mind a little bit. This is a picture of me when I was younger. Wouldn't we love to think that? So I'm sure you remember the character that Tom Cruise played, Maverick, this kind of fictional work. But the truth is, actually, it was quite close to reality. That there were characters like Maverick in military aviation in the 1980s. And actually even in civilian aviation to an extent, these kind of rugged individuals who didn't need people around them, who succeeded because of their technical skills and technical brilliance. But you won't find people like that in aviation today, or they won't last very long if they are like that. Because we've started to learn a lot more about safety, and individual perfection, as much as we want to achieve it, does not deliver safety. We know that. Because when you're doing complex stuff in a complex environment, you are affected by so many things other than your supposed technical brilliance. And at any one time, all these things will have an impact on me or my colleagues to a greater or lesser extent. And it will vary, hence the kind of different sizes of the arrows in the different places, and it all depends on what you're doing at that moment. And it's the same in any complex industry, in any complex job, and it's also very, very true in what you do. So I'm going to talk a little bit about human factors. This is a fairly complex definition that Ken Catchpole came up with. I'm going to give you a simpler one later. But in essence, in healthcare, it's actually the same definition anywhere else. It's about all those things that enhance your performance, or for that matter, detract from your performance. And it's about understanding the effects of the teamwork, the tasks, etc., etc., etc. All those things having an impact on what you do. But before we get into that, just to kind of give you a brief example, I'm going to tell you the story of my late wife, Elaine. So this is Elaine with two kids, Victoria and Adam. This picture's 11, 12 years old now. So Elaine was happy, healthy, and actually had very good health, but had some sinus problems. And so she was booked in for routine surgery to try and sort that out. She was admitted on the 29th of March 2005. Everything seemed fairly straightforward, but she didn't wake up from the attempted procedure, and in fact 13 days later she was dead. So during that time, you know, this was something that was completely unexpected, and we had no real understanding of what had gone on. But certainly what had happened after this is, particularly the surgeon had come to see me. He'd explained, you know, that when she was anaesthetised, this emergency had happened, and they did all the right things, but it just didn't work out. And I accepted that, you know, that's life, that does happen sometimes. And I remember a conversation with the head of the intensive care unit where she'd been transferred to. And I said, you know, I accept that's the case, but hopefully you can learn some lessons when this is investigated. And he said, well, we won't investigate unless you sue or complain. And he wasn't being harsh or horrible, he was just saying how it was. And I think that's where everything changed, because of course in aviation we do investigate routinely to try and understand what happened, not to try and blame anybody, but just to really understand and learn from it. And I couldn't understand why that wasn't going to happen in this case. It's a long story, but in the end an independent review was carried out, and what I'll do is I'll very briefly share with you what we know had happened. So Elaine had been given a very thorough pre-op assessment. There were no significant causes for concern, and she was anaesthetised at 8:35 on that morning. Very quickly it was obvious things were not going to plan. The plan was to use a laryngeal mask, but the masks wouldn't fit. Different sizes were tried, more propofol was given, and within a couple of minutes she was turning blue. Her oxygenation was falling through 75%. We know that 4 minutes in, her oxygenation was 40% or lower. We know that 6 minutes in, the anaesthetist had by this stage started to attempt to intubate, and we know that his assistant, his ODP, had already called for help. And over the next couple of minutes, a number of people arrived in the theatre. The ENT surgeon who was waiting to perform the op, another anaesthetist came in, and another ODP and another 2 recovery nurses arrived in the theatre. And what happened is the medics are gathered round Elaine, attempting to intubate using a variety of techniques and pieces of equipment, and meanwhile the nursing and ODP staff are doing some things under their own initiative. By the time we're 10 minutes in, we know with hindsight, and that's important, with hindsight, that this has become a situation of can't intubate, can't ventilate. This is a recognised emergency, and protocols exist for dealing with this. What we know happened, though, at this point wasn't what you might have expected. But I'm going to pause for a moment and ask you to think about the situation here. So, Elaine is blue, her oxygenation 40% or lower for some 6 minutes, and so far everything they've tried seems to have failed. But she's in an operating theatre equipped to the best standards that you would hope to find. There was no equipment missing, it was subsequently discovered that might have made a difference. The anaesthetist had 16 years experience and was regarded as diligent and careful by his colleagues. Another anaesthetist brought with him additional skills pertaining to difficult airways. The ENT surgeon had 30 years plus experience, and in reality that's the sort of person you might want to have in the room when this sort of emergency was happening. Meanwhile, of the recovery nurses and the ODPs, 3 of the 4 of them were all experienced. If this emergency had to happen, then arguably this was the dream team and the dream moment for it to be dealt with. But what we know happened from this point onwards is that the medics appear to have fixated on the intubation to the exclusion of any other option. And by the time they eventually got Elaine's oxygenation back up to 90%, she'd already been at 40% or lower oxygenation for over 20 minutes. Actually, they weren't happy with the security of the airway. They fiddled around some more, it fell again for a further 10 minutes. And eventually they decide that they're going to abandon the operation for today, and they're going to let her wake up naturally. They mentioned to the recovery nurses that she might take longer than normal to wake up, and they go off to continue with their operating rests. But of course, as you can imagine, you know, whatever happened there was pretty pointless, and in reality it was an hour and a half later under the care of another anaesthetist when she was eventually transferred to the intensive care unit. And by that stage it was too late anyway. So what we know from an independent review that was done by Professor Mike Harmer at the time and from the subsequent inquest is to begin with, if we look at the medics, in his own words, the lead anaesthetist lost control. There was a dispute in the inquest about who people felt was in charge at different points. The decision making appears to have become fixated on intubation to the exclusion of any other option, and actually under stress we know that that's not unusual. People tend to fixate. The communication processes appear to have dried up completely amongst the team. The story with the nursing and the OGP staff was slightly different. They were generally aware of what was happening and what needed to happen. When the senior OGP called for help, one of the recovery nurses had come in, and she was asked to go and fetch the tracheostomy set. There was already a quick trach kit in theatre. She came back in, she announced she had the tracheostomy tray, and she apparently was just completely ignored. You know, maybe under the stress, those doctors didn't actually hear her. Another one of the recovery nurses came in, she saw Elaine's colour, she saw her vital signs, and instinctively she knew this was serious. She went out, she phoned intensive care. She came back in, she announced that a bed was available. And to quote from the inquest, the doctors looked at her as if to say, "What's wrong? You're overreacting." And she got that sense so strongly she went back out and cancelled the bed. So in summary then, there's apparent failings here in situational awareness, in decision making, in communication, team working, in the ability to speak up, and all these sorts of things that we start to talk about as human factors in aviation, or non-technical skills perhaps more appropriately, we know are the cause of about 75% of aviation accidents. And as you can imagine, I've reflected long and hard over the last few years about the differences in our industries. And there's no doubt that aviation has some really significant differences from healthcare, but I also think there's no doubt there's some lessons that can be usefully learned. It's been a bit of a journey for me since then, and what I'm going to do is just share with you some observations and share with you some thoughts about what I've seen and how things are developing. And I'll be happy at the end to take some questions as well, by the way, just to widen the discussion. So when I first started to look at, talk to people in hospitals and in healthcare generally, there was an interesting kind of perception on what hospitals and healthcare was about. They were kind of nice warm places. They were places with lots of flowers and friendly smiling people. They were kind of like the church. You know, the healthcare industry, if you like, the NHS was an institution that felt like it had been around for thousands of years. It was a bit like the school system. You know, 20, 30 years ago, there was no such thing as a bad school. They just didn't exist. The idea of closing a school that wasn't working well was simply unthinkable. But what we know from the data now is that a significant number of people each year die as a result of inadvertent error. I don't have the latest figures for Scotland. The last figure I got for England was about 10,000 a year now. Dead due to inadvertent error. That's just in England. That's a pretty big figure. The reality is the industry that you work in is much more like this. And if you look at any one of those incidents on there, fewer people died than died at Mid-South Hospital. And that's taking the more optimistic estimates. I was very lucky to spend a brief time meeting an American doctor who had become the chief exec of a hospital in the US, and he got this, he understood this. And he said to me one day, he said, "You know, Martin," he said, "when I walk into my hospital, I feel reassured to know that my patients are as safe as they would be working on the deck of an American aircraft carrier, where you've got about a 1 in 300 chance of dying on each cruise." The difference is that in healthcare it's not always obvious. So you are working in a real safety critical industry, and that's always really important. And I think there's still parts of healthcare where we really forget that. So what's happened since 2005? Yeah, we're starting to see tools like checklists appearing, we're starting to see simulation, TRM, team resource management, what in aviation we call crew resource management. There's a greater kind of understanding that safety is a bit of an issue, kind of a recognition that maybe something around design and the system is important, and I'll come on to that in a minute, and there's certainly a better recognition of what we call non-technical skills, and I kind of talked about those a lot with my late wife's case. What do I mean by non-technical skills? So we give them headings in aviation, we tend to talk about things like situational awareness, your understanding of the big picture. We look at decision making, leadership, teamwork. And what we do is we don't just talk about those in abstract ways. We look at the specific behaviours that demonstrate the possession of those skills. You're actually very lucky tonight because you have a world-class expert in Professor Roland Flynn, who has done the majority of the work, I would say, over the years around this area. I'm here with a colleague of mine, Katie. Katie was in the sim the other day. Katie, you were being assessed under framework that Roland had developed. So you can blame her later. So you're actually very lucky here in Aberdeen, and a lot of work has been done, particularly in Scotland, around non-technical skills in surgery, anaesthesia, for scrub nurses, and that's really powerful stuff. There are some interesting ones, and I just picked these out of the framework that we're assessed against as pilots. And I only picked these, cherry-picked these items, because these are some of the things that I don't see much of in healthcare. These are some of the behaviours that I would really love to see doctors, nurses, allied health professionals, leaders using more of. What do you think about those? When was the last time you had a very senior doctor turn around to you and say, this is what we're doing, what do you think we should do? I'm guessing from the expressions it doesn't happen, no. But how's the journey going towards becoming a proper safety critical industry? I think there are kind of three things that I've noticed when I talk to leaders in healthcare. We still think of error as being about poor performance and some form of individual weakness or failure in your technical skills. The reality is we know that when things go wrong, they are often a minor part of it. That actually there's a much bigger thing out there. And there's a continual focus on learning, there's no doubt about that. There's probably more investigations going on in healthcare at the moment than in any other industry, and it is an industry on its own. And we learn a lot about what has happened. So, for example, we'll learn in a particular incident that the doctor didn't follow protocols. That's great, that's the end of the investigation. But why? Why didn't they follow protocols? What was the normal way of behaving in that department? What did people normally do? What were the pressures they were under? What was going on around them? Had the lists changed and all these sorts of things? We never go into those details. And I think there is still a focus on the frontline inadequacies. When things go wrong, it's because the frontline are at fault. It's because they are these weak performers. We don't tend to look at the wider design of the system and the leadership that leads us at that point. Do any of you recognise who these two characters are? Okay, a few comments. So Ayrton Senna on the left, the racing driver who died over 20 years ago now, and on the right is Professor Sid Watkins, a doctor. I was very lucky to spend an evening with Sid many years ago. Sadly, Sid's passed away now. But Sid Watkins, who was the Chief Medical Officer of Formula One, was devastated by the loss of Ayrton Senna in the racing accident. And from that point, he kind of committed that he wanted to make a difference. He wanted to change Formula One to make it much safer. What he didn't do was he didn't say to the Formula One drivers, hey guys, slow down, don't take risks, take it easy. Because he knew that that was a complete waste of time. But what he did do is he started to persuade the governing body to make slight changes to the rules. He started to persuade the track designers to make subtle design changes. He started to talk to the manufacturers about making slight changes and innovations in the cars to make them safer. And over time, what has happened is Formula One has become much safer. It's still a high-risk sport. People have died since, but actually only one death since Ayrton died. And that's an amazing tribute really to what Sid did, and that's a lesson in what we call system safety, system design, that was brought to you not by a pilot but by a doctor. And sometimes when healthcare looks at aviation, they tend to take the wrong lessons. I'm particularly inspired by Dr. Kevin Fong here, who I worked with on the BBC Horizon programme, and he was the one who kind of pointed this out to me. So this is a nice diagram of an incident that happened to a Qantas A380 airliner. An engine exploded, and a heroic team of crew, of pilots and cabin crew, safely brought the aircraft back to land 2 hours later, and nobody got hurt. And what tends to happen is we tend to look at this and say, that's how we want to be in healthcare. We want to be like those heroes, almost like those mavericks, if you like. Thing is, what they were doing in that case, in aviation, we had kind of failed them already. We gave them an engine that could explode in an uncontained way and shouldn't have done. So what the crew were doing is they were trying to mitigate the consequences of an error. And what ideally we want them to be doing is avoiding that situation in the first place. Let me give you an example from healthcare. So the NHS has vast purchasing power. They purchase vast amounts of drugs. And it so happens that those drugs which do different things are often put in similar packaging. I'm sure none of you have experienced that. And then what they do is they give it to the front line and they say, now guys, be careful, double check, don't make a mistake, you need to be perfect, don't get this wrong. What has happened is the system has given you the error-prone situation and left the front line to deal with it. And that's where we're now looking at healthcare, because that's where arguably the biggest changes and the biggest safety improvements can be made. And okay, I'm talking at a national level here, but actually at each individual hospital we can start to look around us at the systems, the processes, and see how we can make it easier to do the right things. There's a lot of work that's been done over the years. I mean, this is just the front of some booklets that were produced in the late 1990s, actually, about, the original work was done in the 90s, and these booklets were produced in the mid-2000s, on how we can start to design packaging, on how we start to design a dispensary, how we standardise drugs storage and all those sorts of things. But it's kind of been forgotten. But actually there's a lot of good work out there. Do any of you work in wards where you have machines like these, where the keypads on each machine are in a slightly different order? Does that cause mistakes? Professor Jim Reason, who is the kind of godfather of human factors and human understanding of error, once said to me, if we could just standardise pumps like this in healthcare, we'd save far more lives than any other intervention. Any anaesthetists in the room? Very sheepish, aren't you? You recognise this? So this is an anaesthetic machine. All I want to focus on is you'll see there's a little red arrow about part way down that machine. So if you can imagine, the anaesthetist is here at their machine, and somewhere down here is a little switch, which you can't actually see that easily. Let's look at a better picture. So in that position it sends basically all those wonderful gases to the patient. In the other position it vents them to the atmosphere, and it's a kind of for test purposes and all that. Do you think it's possible that that switch could be left in the wrong position and for a patient to be starved of those rather important gases? 3 times in 1 month at one particular hospital I know of. Now, what we would say is if that happens, it must be bad clinicians. They should have checked it. But actually, if that was any other safety critical industry, like the nuclear industry or oil, that switch would be guarded. It would have all sorts of alarms on it as well, and it would be really hard to get it into the wrong position and still use the machine. In healthcare, we just accept a design like this and say, yeah, whatever, let the front line deal with it. The one particular hospital, they call that a death switch, by the way. So the reality is that all the things that you do at the front line, at the kind of pinnacle of that triangle, are influenced by the processes, the procurement, the training and all that sort of stuff. And that's very important to remember. And we need to start getting all these things right in healthcare if we're to make a difference. The reality is the system is complex. It's really complex. And what we need to do, and I said to you another definition of human factors, is we need to design things that make it easy to do the right things. when it's easy to do the right things and hard to do the wrong things, then you're actually in a much better place. Life not only becomes safer, but it actually becomes more efficient. And when you are making changes and improvements, you need to make a safety case, I would suggest. You need to say to yourself, am I actually going to make things safer? Am I going to make it easier to do the right things? And that's really important. In healthcare, a lot of the rules you have, a lot of the processes actually are quite complicated. I'm going to give you a bit of an example here. This is some work from a guy called Radiology Cath Labs. He's the kind of French equivalent of Jim Reason, I like to say. And you all drive at 70 miles an hour on the motorway. That's the speed limit, isn't it? None of you drive faster than that. I can tell you all law-abiding citizens who are very safety conscious. Sometimes you're a bit late though. Everybody else is going a bit faster than the speed limit, so it's probably okay to go a bit faster and maybe just that little bit faster. I would suggest to you that if you look at aviation and nuclear and oil and industries like that, we tend to live our lives around this green line. We tend to, sometimes maybe we go over a bit, but most of the time we're within it. In healthcare, I would suggest that a lot of you are probably spending a lot of time in that red zone. Not because you're bad people, but because you're just trying to get the job done despite the system, not because of it. And the challenge over the next few years in healthcare is to create a situation when you can work within the rules, be safe, and it be recognised. And the day that I know that we've achieved that is when a chief executive of a hospital publicly thanks a porter for refusing to take a patient into the operating theatre because they weren't happy about the safety checks that were being done. Finally, just a quick mention on just culture. It's a big topic at the moment in healthcare, and I think it's a very relevant topic. I suppose there are two kind of extremes. There is the inadvertent human error that we all make. There's also then the gross negligence, the deliberate acts, okay? And there's a kind of a scale of how we deal with those, whether we support or coach people or whether we sanction people. I would suggest that in most safety critical industries, we tend to assume this. We don't see a lot of that in reality. In healthcare, I would suggest a lot of the time we work down this end. We assume guilt, we assume gross negligence, as opposed to looking at the wider system. So what have I been doing for the last 10, 11 years? So back in 2007, I've been talking to a lot of people in healthcare about the culture that I worked in and human factors and aviation. And in the end, somebody said we ought to maybe form a group, and that's what we did. Rona was at the original meeting that we had in London back in 2007, along with about 40 other characters. So we formed a group, it became a charity, and it simply exists to promote an understanding of human factors in healthcare. We kind of work on around three main strands. We try and encourage healthcare to look at how high reliability industry works. We're trying to encourage the development of independent investigation, as it's done in aviation, and trying to encourage intelligent regulation, and also trying to influence the whole education and training framework to include things like human factors and safety and all that sort of stuff. And slowly things are bearing fruit. By all means, log on to the website, register if you like, and just stay in touch. And we're just trying to encourage best practice. Most of my work now is at the policy level, mostly in England. The good news is if I had to go into hospital right now, I'd probably rather come into hospital in Scotland, because actually there's a lot of good stuff happening, and I tend to find in Scotland policy changes tend to happen slightly quicker, and maybe that's just the nature of the society, maybe it's the nature of governance, I don't know what. England is lagging a little bit behind, not perhaps as badly as Wales, and Northern Ireland at the moment, I have to say, but England is certainly lagging in that respect. You know, you're doing good things up there. We have open seminars, by the way. They're free to attend. The next one's 13th of October, I'm afraid it's down in Oxford. One day we will come up to Scotland and do one, and that's the promise. Okay. But yeah, I'm happy to take any questions and open up the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Martin. That was a very inspirational talk. I'm sure everyone would agree. So we do have some people with some questions, but we'll try and go through them and then open it up to them.
Absolutely, yeah.
If that's
Great.
okay. So I'm going to hand them the mic, which
okay,
they're
yep.
petrified of. But, thank you.
Thanks very much. Martin Bromiley, anaesthetist and intensivist here in Aberdeen. Just wondered, people within systems, they can see there's a lack of safety or something that could be improved, but maybe only a few people see it, or maybe more people see it. But what are your top tips for getting people on board and, you know, bringing people on side when you just want to try and address an issue?
I think there's two sides. I think one is data and evidence is very, very important. But to date, data and evidence hasn't moved the debate that much further forward. So I think, I really do think the power of personal stories are important. And all of you will have worked or will work in a department, in an area where a patient will have a suboptimal experience, and in many cases to a massive extent. And engaging with those people is so, so important, because that helps to move the discussion on, so people can look at the data, which is probably already there, in a much better way. And I think the other thing is often just trying to look at data and then compare it elsewhere. So a lovely example from one particular hospital, they had a board meeting, and a member of the board was looking at some figures, and they were talking about a particular care pathway. And they said, at the board meeting, they said, we've had 97% of our patients have been through that care pathway. And the board members all said, that's jolly good, wonderful. And then the chair said, hold on a minute, so that means 3% of people didn't. What were their names? And when we personalise things like that, I think that's so important. There's another chap, Paul Levy, who ran a hospital in the US, who at his board meetings would not talk about statistics. He would tend to say, what are the names of the people that we have maimed and killed in the last month? And I just think that is so important to start to personalise that a little bit. And the irony is, you know, I've been working very recently with a lady whose daughter died. It was very similar to my late wife's case. She is an intensive care nurse herself. And she said, I want to help make things different. And the hospital won't even talk to her. And that's really frustrating, because here's somebody who could do a lot of good.
I'm researcher in infectious prevention control, George. I'm just wondering, can there ever be too many checklists?
Yeah, definitely. So, so I went to hospital recently, and they said, somebody put their hand up and asked a question. They said, we've got this checklist now. They said it's how to put a central line in, and it's got 50 items that we need to check. And I think the problem is there's almost like this thing now, we've got to do checklists. If we do a checklist, we're safe. No, you're not. So in aviation, we tend to have two sorts of checklists. We have a checklist which checks that the most important things are being done. So for example, when we're on final approach, we don't have a long checklist about how to land. What we do is we just have 3 items that we check. They kind of check that the really big things have been done, the really big things that could screw things up have been done. That's all there is to it. So have we done those yet? Great. We can land now. How you then land, you don't need a checklist. You learn that over time. And in the same way, I think when we talk about that 50-item checklist for a central line, what has probably happened is somebody has developed a checklist and they want to make sure that it's done perfectly, because if it's not, they'll get the blame. So they've covered everything. But it ceases to be a usable tool. It ceases to make it easy to do the right things. So I think we need to be careful when we choose about that. Second form of checklist we use in aviation is a read and do, and we tend to use that for abnormal and emergency cases. Some of the anaesthetists will be aware that there's been developments of what we call quick reference handbooks now on how to handle things like failed intubation, can't intubate, can't ventilate, those sorts of things. I'd be interested to see how those develop over the years, because when things go wrong, you get your cognitive capacity shrinks to that of a hamster, and you actually, it's really hard to think about what you're doing, no matter how well rehearsed you are, and that's where checklists can be really useful. But a lot of the time, actually, I think we probably go over the top with them in healthcare. Is it actually making it easier to do our job?
Hi, Gerald Dempsey, Department of Management, Upper Gordon University. Simple question, potentially. What's your single biggest challenge?
In healthcare?
In achieving your objective to make healthcare safer?
Engaging the leaders of healthcare units. So the chief execs of boards or trusts, the leaders of national organisations. Some of them are genuinely very engaged, but there are many that are so fixated at the moment on money. Although Boris says they're going to get 30 million a year from now on. 30 million a week, I should say. That was. So that's great. So I think that's the real challenge, because the danger is you know, you're not going to start to see efficiencies unless you start making it easy for people to do things. And that's the real. We make things complex, and we don't actually fundamentally start to look at the system. And the other thing I think within that is those leaders need to look at really innovative ways of doing business. Because the classic is GP practice, primary care. There was a lovely article last week in the BBC News, which is still on there. A GP was saying that he felt like he was working for a budget airline. You know, they were even doing consultations by email, and he said this is just wrong. And instinctively, we feel that's wrong. Instinctively, patients don't feel that's right. But the reality is that we can't afford the NHS we want. And so we have to find new ways of doing business. And I think things will change massively over the next 10 years, not because of politics or because of the system leaders, but because of what other organisations outside are doing. And I think things will change a lot, and we need leaders who are prepared to look at that and to be brave on some of these decisions.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Katrina Littingham. I'm a lecturer in nursing from Robert Gordon's as well. I've got two questions. So the first question is, have you seen the change that you hoped for in the NHS since you got involved?
Yeah, I think so. So in England, we had Secretary of State for Health, Jeremy Hunt. Any junior doctors in the room, by the way? So we had Jeremy Hunt standing up in March at a global summit saying, I want to see a development of a learning culture in healthcare. We are going to have an independent investigation body like the Air Accident Investigation Branch. And when doctors make mistakes, we need to look at the system, not the doctor. To hear that was amazing for me after the last 11 years. But that political speak is just talk. What's happening at the front line is still lagging a long way behind. But it is that, it's frustrating. I thought we could change things in 2-3 years. Actually, healthcare is a much bigger thing, and I was very naive. So, kind of.
Start.
It's a start, yeah.
And my second question is, what would you want me to teach student nurses for to be nurses of the future?
The normality of error. Absolutely. The normality of error in everybody. You make mistakes at home, you make mistakes when you're driving, but when you come to work, you put on your uniform and you don't make any more mistakes. That's not how it goes. Error's normal, so we need to develop systems and ways of working and behaviours that help us avoid, trap and mitigate those errors.
Thank you.
Millie Galvin, I'm clinical pharmacist in oncology. I'm just wondering, how do we train effective clinical leaders of the future to recognise these human factors and their risk to patient safety?
I think we need to look at leaders. There are a few good examples in healthcare at the moment of leaders who really make things different, and we need to look to those for good as exemplars, and we need to look outside other industries. And I kind of think healthcare is getting a bit tired of aviation. I think we need to start looking at other industries. I think we need to start looking at all sorts of industries. We need to have leaders who can go and look at how Marks and Spencer's work and come in and say, actually, I like the way they do business. We need to have leaders who can go out and look at, you know, what computer companies are doing with artificial intelligence, and how can we use that. We need to have people who look outside and can be different. And I think we need to probably develop training programs that help them develop those skills over years. But a lot of it's role modelling. I mean, the reality is you become the person you aspire to be by looking at those around you. But there are some leaders, I think. And it's interesting, when I talked to the Care Quality Commission in England, Professor Mike Richards, who's the Chief Inspector of Hospitals, and you ask him the question, what's the one thing that you see that is constant amongst the really good places? The answer is the leader. So it's critical.
Robert Coleman, Charge Nurse Cath Labs. There's national safety standards for invasive procedures being introduced in England, which will be mandatory in September this year. Do you think that's a positive forward step in patient safety, or do you think it may just fall into become a paper exercise?
I'd like to say it's a positive step. I suspect your cynicism might be appropriate. I think we have to get much better in healthcare at recognising that when there's an evidence base for something, that actually when we start arguing about it, we're becoming a little bit churlish. Sometimes I think we have to grow up and say, you know what, that is a better way of doing it, let's just do it. I think the problem is we encourage, I've talked about innovation in leaders, and I've talked about innovation in systems, but day-to-day care, if I'm going in for a procedure, the last thing I want is an innovative anaesthetist. I don't, and the problem is even if you're a brilliant surgeon and you've seen people doing things one way and you say, you know what, I can do that a better way, even if you're right, the confusion you leave in your wake by doing something different for everybody else detracts from any safety advantage. So I support it, but I do tend to think we still have people, sadly in healthcare, will often say, actually, I'm not doing that. I could do that in my job. I could say, read some procedures and say, you know what, I'm not going to do that today. I wouldn't be in a job for very long.
Thank you.
I think that's all the people that registered with their questions, so we can open it up to the rest if anyone's got any questions that they would like to ask. Oh, I'm going to do that question time thing. Looking forward to this.
So ideally, I want somebody over this side to ask a question next.
Yeah. Working off that latte here.
Hello, thank you. In healthcare, we have multiple regulators.
Yes.
Do you think that causes a problem?
Yes, undoubtedly. I spoke to the chair of an NHS trust who said, you know, for compliance we've got page after page, and we've got multiple regulators who require similar things but not exactly the same, and that's when regulation becomes a burden. And there's no doubt that we will see over the years the regulators combining. I think there is an attempt at the moment to try and streamline a lot of the regulation, but you can't kind of, I do agree with you, it's just becomes too burdensome for people to cope with, because you spend most of your time trying to do what the regulator wants, not do what's right. And that's not a good place to be.
Because the CAA does everything, I think.
Yeah, so absolutely. So in aviation, you know, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about the design of an aircraft, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about an individual's training, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about whether your bags have been lost and not recovered by the airline, who do you contact? I don't know, CAA, I suppose. And the answer is you're almost always right. So although, and we criticise our regulator a lot in aviation and give them a hard time, actually when I started working with healthcare I realised how lucky we were. But Let's also be clear that in aviation actually everything's slightly simpler, everything's a lot smaller, and we don't have this kind of historical inertia. So I think it will be a little while before we get to fewer regulators, but it's certainly, I think it has to be the way to go, there's no doubt about that.
Did you have a question?
What am I now?
Hi, Rona Beattie, I'm a consultant anaesthetist as well. Martin, just to come back to your answer on one of the questions that was asked about, and you talked about getting leaders, senior people, to know and understand the issues. And I would say that personally here, I found it's been relatively easy at least to get leaders to say, oh yes, it's very important, but actually to seem to really understand the issue. And people on the ground, when we do our education sessions, our students, our staff, the people who are here, they get it. But there's a whole group of people in the middle who are required to deliver the message from up above and the message that's coming from so many different areas, and cope with us down at the bottom who are pushing for them. And to me, that's a big area that's not been unlocked at all, and I just wonder if you might comment on that.
Yeah, so we've talked about that as a charity many times before, and you've got that kind of middle grade. So we're talking at the moment, we're looking at one project potentially over the coming couple of years, which will be around looking at safety leadership in other industries. I'm smiling as I'm looking at Rona here. Looking at safety leadership in other industries. What is it leaders in the oil industry do? What is it that leaders in the nuclear industry do and in aviation do in terms of their actual behaviours that encourages people working for them to behave in the right way and to do things safely and to do whatever they're asked to do in their new procedures or regulations or whatever. And clearly that is going to influence, I think, ultimately the middle grade, because we regard them all as leaders. The reality is human behaviour is that we work for, if we're given a target, that's what we try and achieve. We can't help ourselves, that's what we do. And I learned that very early on in a previous industry. And so we have to make sure that the targets that people are given, even if they're soft targets, from the top are ones that really matter. So I think that the influence on the middle grades hopefully will come from the top and a little bit from the bottom. And actually the middle managers are often in a very difficult position because actually they're just trying to do a job, and sometimes they don't always understand the situation that's going on. But sometimes they understand it very, very well, and they're the ones who kind of have the difficulty of dealing with both sides. So I'm kind of not really answering your question, but I am saying that it's something that I think we need to be looking at. And we need to be looking at, what can we learn from a manager on an oil rig? What can we learn from, somebody who's a captain of a deep sea trawler? Okay.
Denise Johnson, a treatment advisor and nurse manager. You spoke about the aspect of situational awareness, and I wondered if you can share some of your thoughts around how we develop staff to be cognisant of the situation that they're in and to actually stop and ask the question, what's happening here, when things are actually clearly.
That's an interesting question actually, because I think it's partly through your own behaviours, how you do that. So in aviation we would say we use simulation a lot to help us to develop that. So we go into the simulator, we do something, and then the person who's running the simulator will say, actually, this is what was going on around you that you didn't notice, and this was the effect it had. I do think it's a lot about behaviours that so for example, people will look at you and you'll often seem to have the answers, but they won't see how you got the answers. And so sometimes it is deliberately using those open questions with people, saying, what do you think the big issue is at the minute? And saying to them, especially, look, I'm just trying to understand this, so I just need some help from you guys. it's a way of encouraging people to think differently, to be questioning about the environment. It's a very, very complex topic. I mean, academically, it's a really complex topic. Rona wrote a book, Safety at the Sharp End, and she talks about it being the 3 stages of situational awareness, of being what, so what, and now what. Have I got that right? Thank you. That would have been embarrassing. And it's trying to encourage that process of understanding what is going on, and then thinking, so what does that mean? And then thinking, so what do we need to do about it? And kind of making that a little bit more explicit, and actually debriefing it and talking about it with people. Now that's not easy, but actually if you look at some of the kind of the work that's been done, say for surgeons and anaesthetists and that, just looking at some of the things around building their situational awareness, it starts to give a clue to some of the behaviours that we can make explicit in what we do.
I think what you've said and what you've done is just tremendous. But I'll just come back about that earlier question, whether you've achieved your objective. And I think part of the problem is that there is some pathology going on within the system, isn't there? Because then, whatever you throw at it, it seems to have some way of subverting it.
Yeah.
Whether it's checklists, whether it's safe situational awareness. So I think there's something really fundamentally wrong, and it needs something more radical. I happen to think the answers do lie in what you're talking about in terms of design, and I think partly it's to do with, I think the managerial training has to be substantially changed. I think it's pot luck how you get into management. I think, coming back to what Rona was saying, I think that middle management is very, very critical. And something has to be changing about the pathways to leadership. Because at the moment, people choose selectively to go to leadership and think they're good leaders and stay in leadership positions for God knows how long. And that can't be right when the system's failing. And the other thing is that the airline changed, nuclear industry changes, because if something goes wrong, there's an immediate feedback.
Yes.
There's a political lashback. But in healthcare, doctors are very protected and managers are very defensive. So, what I would see is something much more radical, such as, actually making healthcare systems much more politically accountable, much more than they are at the moment. Opening up the system massively. Because, as you said yourself, you couldn't even get the data.
Yeah.
And I unfortunately have got, experience of that, where I think the system is very, very defensive.
Yes, is the short answer, and it's interesting. It's interesting. The system does have a way of beating things down, and it does. But at the same time, I think probably there are some fundamental things that we can do. I think independent investigation, proper independent investigation, providing safe space for clinicians is probably very, very important, because we can start to get qualitative data about what happens when things go wrong. We can start to hold people, I think, organisations to account. And I think actually performance management is very important. It's kind of a dirty word, I think. In aviation, that's what we do all the time. We just don't call it that. When we go in the sim, that's what's happening to us. Our performance is being honed and coached and all that sort of stuff. Talk about Formula One, I was very lucky to spend a bit of time with the Chief Medical Officer of McLaren recently. And you look at the data that they gather on each racing driver. So one racing driver will turn into a corner, another racing driver on the same team will turn into that corner, 0.025 of a second earlier. And that's the difference between one winning and one losing. And they'll feed that back to the driver straight to say, hey, look, just turning in that slight wrong moment, so if you just do this, and it's refining that performance all the time. That's a positive thing, that's a good thing. But that also has to have a sharp edge sometimes to say, and actually if you don't improve your performance, I'm sorry, but you won't be with us. And certainly Terence Stevens, the head of GMC, has talked a lot about performance management recently as some area that the NHS needs to start looking into seriously, because it's something we simply don't do. But I think that needs to apply not just to doctors, but all healthcare professionals, leaders.
Can you ask something? When you're talking about the data,
Oh, there you go. What's this mean?
you're saying that you need data to actually be able to change things, and in our system we have data exports.
Yeah.
And that's well and good, and in theory
Yeah.
the system's phenomenal, right?
Yeah.
If somebody explains it to you properly, you think, oh, that sounds great, and that's how it'll work.
Yeah.
But in theory, what happens is nobody has time to fill in the data exports,
Yeah.
because that means you've either got to you're already late in leaving, so you have to stay even later
Yeah.
to do the data. Now, in a real emergencies, they're filled in,
Yeah.
but it's all the non-emergencies which will become an emergency
Yeah.
if it's not highlighted. It's not a good system because it's not used properly.
And I think it's interesting because Sir Liam Donaldson, in his report, Organisation with a Memory, talked about the importance of learning from near misses. But I think fundamentally the problem is we still don't learn from the real emergencies, let alone the near misses. You can't learn from the near misses until you understand the big emergencies. So I think we do need to start learning from those properly, and that's what we're not doing, is we're going too shallow on those real emergencies. So I agree with what you say about the DATEX. It's slightly cumbersome, that idea of reporting. We get the same as well. We report things, and actually it's hard work to report. Actually, it does lead to a lot of safety improvements, but you need to be sure when you submit that report it is going to lead to an improvement. And I think that's maybe in healthcare where it hasn't done, because we tend to look at these as superficial things. National Reporting and Learning System. People talk about NHS not being safe. The National Reporting and Learning System, as far as I'm aware, is the largest safety reporting system in the world. 60,000 reports a month. I mean, that's phenomenal. But nobody does anything with it. But we need to get better at understanding the big emergencies, and then we can start to make the other reports much more meaningful. We can start to see, actually, if I'd done that, it would have made a massive difference. But it's a cultural change as well. Until we start to really understand things properly, I don't think we'll really see big improvements in those sorts of systems.
It seems that the questions have come to a natural end.
That's a Friday for you.
I'd like to thank Martin very much for such a thought-provoking and inspiring talk. I wonder if we can get your permission to take some of your inspiration and just throw it into the pond and hopefully see the ripples emanate from that.
Okay.
We've got a great range of people here from all ranges and all spectra of healthcare workers and all ages too, and it's smashing to see that. So let's see what happens.
Lovely.
Thank you so much for joining. Thank
Thank you once again, everyone, for coming tonight. I'm sure everyone will agree it's been a completely worthwhile Friday evening. So thanks again. Thank you. I'd like to thank Martin personally. I feel like I have been pestering you for a very long time. And he did crack under pressure, even though he's a maverick, he did actually crack under pressure. So thank you so much for taking your personal time out to come and see us. So it's very important that we don't just do this amazing night tonight and then say, well, that was really good, wasn't it? And don't actually do anything about it. So everyone's signed in, and there's no way that I'm just going to do this on my own. So I'm actually going to speak to all the experts that we have here and perhaps form an interest group. We've got amazing pockets of human factors going on through education and through different departments. But one thing that we don't actually do very well is we don't actually share that information very well with each other. mostly because sometimes we don't have the time to do it. If this interest group is formed, however, we might be able to do that, and one branch might be able to talk to another about something that they're doing that others could do. So I will send out a mass email, whether you like it or not, you're involved by association, that's how I work. So once again, if you could show your appreciation to Martin Bromiley, and thank you very much for coming this evening.